One man blocked the most important crypto bill in American history twice. Then, he posted 3 words that flipped the entire game. And 72 hours from now, those 3 words become law. Brian Armstrong did not derail this bill once. He derailed it twice. On January 14th, hours before the Senate Banking Committee was set to begin its markup session, he posted on X that Coinbase could not support the bill as written, and the entire vote was cancelled. 7 sentences. That was all it took. 7 sentences blocked the most consequential piece of crypto legislation in American history at the last possible moment, sent the crypto market into uncertainty for months, and turned Armstrong into the single most powerful obstacle standing between XRP and the regulatory certainty that would unlock institutional adoption at scale. And then on April 9th, he posted 3 words: "We agree." That was it. We agree. But this is the part almost nobody understands. The same CEO who had blocked the bill twice in a single year, who had told the world he would rather have no bill than a bad bill, who had cost the XRP community months of waiting, reversed course completely and endorsed the Clarity Act publicly, alongside the US Treasury Secretary and the SEC Chairman. And now, 72 hours before the vote that determines whether this reversal translates into law, the question that matters for every XRP holder watching this video is not what Armstrong did in January. It is what his reversal in April means for the price of XRP in the weeks and months that follow Thursday's committee markup. Tonight, I'm going to walk you through the complete story of Armstrong and the Clarity Act, from the January collapse to the April reversal to the May 14th vote, in full detail. I'm going to show you exactly what changed between January and April, and why that change makes Thursday's vote the most consequential single event in XRP's history. I'm going to walk through Trump's specific role in forcing this bill through, and why his administration's framing of the Clarity Act as a national security issue rather than a crypto bill is the political architecture that makes failure politically painful for every senator who might otherwise delay. And I'm going to show you precisely what happens to XRP in every scenario on the other side of Thursday's vote. Before I continue, this is not financial advice. I'm sharing publicly available information for educational purposes only. Always do your own research and consult a qualified financial professional before making any investment decisions. And this is where the story becomes dangerous. Let me start with the January collapse, because understanding how close this bill came to dying tells you something essential about how significant the current alignment is and why Thursday's vote is so consequential. The Clarity Act passed the House of Representatives on July 17, 2025, with a 294 to 134 bipartisan vote. That margin is remarkable in a Congress where almost nothing passes with broad bipartisan support. It reached the Senate with momentum, with industry backing, and with what appeared to be a realistic path to committee passage in the first weeks of 2026. Then the Senate Banking Committee's version of the bill added language that would restrict crypto platforms from offering passive yield on stablecoin balances. Banks, led by the American Bankers Association, had been lobbying for this provision for months. They argued that allowing exchanges like Coinbase to offer rewards on USDC holdings was a loophole that undermined the stablecoin regulation the Genius Act had established. Coinbase had staked a significant portion of its revenue on exactly this practice. Their third quarter 2025 shareholder letter disclosed that stablecoin-related revenue represented approximately 20% of their income, roughly $355 million in a single quarter, and that USDC growth was occurring primarily on Coinbase's platform through the rewards program being threatened. Now here's where things get serious. On January 14th of 2026, hours before the Senate Banking Committee was scheduled to vote on the markup, Armstrong posted on X. He said, Coinbase unfortunately could not support the bill as written. He cited a de facto ban on tokenized equities. He cited DeFi prohibitions he said would give the government unlimited access to financial data. He cited the stablecoin yield restriction. He called it an erosion of the CFTC's authority. Within hours of that post, Senator Tim Scott announced the postponement of the markup indefinitely. The political damage was immediate. Armstrong had effectively broken the industry coalition at the moment that mattered most. Andreessen Horowitz and most other major industry players had backed the bill. The White House had been pushing for it. The Treasury had been supporting it. Brad Garlinghouse of Ripple had called it a massive step forward. CoinCenter's executive director had expressed optimism. But Armstrong's opposition, as the CEO of the largest publicly traded crypto exchange in the United States and the platform that manages the infrastructure for USDC, was the one opposition that mattered enough to give Chairman Tim Scott political cover to delay. The bill went into limbo for months. March came and went without a markup date. The Senate left for Easter recess on March 30th without any resolution. Galaxy Research calculated that with only 18 working weeks remaining before the midterm recess on October 5th, each week of delay made full passage structurally less viable. Senator Lummis was blunt. Miss the window, and the bill waits until 2030. And what happens next changes everything. Then April 9th happened. And April 9th is the day that changed everything. On April 9th of 2026, three things happened in sequence that together represent the most significant single-day alignment of political, regulatory, and industry forces behind the Clarity Act in its entire legislative history. The first thing was Armstrong's reversal. He posted on X, responding to U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's call for swift Senate action. He wrote, "We agree. Thank you, Scott Bessent, for saying it. It's time to pass the Clarity Act. Grateful for all the bipartisan work among senators and staff over the past several months to make this a strong bill. 3 words. We agree." But what those 3 words mean in context is everything. The single most influential industry figure standing between the Clarity Act and passage had just publicly switched from opponent to champion. The reason was a compromise brokered by Senators Tom Tillis and Angela Alsobrooks that banned passive yield on stablecoins, but explicitly protected activity-based rewards tied to actual transaction volume or platform use. Banks got the restriction. Coinbase protected what mattered most to their business model. The stalemate that had blocked the bill for months was resolved. The second thing was Bessent's Wall Street Journal op-ed. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent published a piece that did something no previous supporter of the bill had done publicly. He framed the Clarity Act not as crypto legislation, but as national security. He warned that the United States risks falling behind countries like Singapore and Abu Dhabi, which have already built clear crypto regulatory frameworks and are actively attracting American blockchain developers and crypto companies that have been driven offshore by regulatory uncertainty. But this is the part almost nobody is connecting. He wrote that 1 in 6 Americans now owns some form of digital asset, that the global crypto market sits between $2 and $3 trillion, that passing the Clarity Act is essential for the United States to maintain its dominance in global financial infrastructure. He called industry opponents of the bill nihilists. He specifically connected the Clarity Act to the Genius Act, saying stablecoin regulation cannot function effectively without broader market structure clarity. And he ended with an urgent call to Congress, emphasizing that Senate floor time is limited and the window is closing. The third thing was Paul Atkins. The SEC chairman posted on X that the SEC and CFTC have already built a joint initiative called Project Crypto in direct preparation for the Clarity Act. Both agencies are ready to implement the bill the moment Congress acts. The SEC chairman of the United States publicly announced that his agency is implementation ready and waiting for Congress to vote. CFTC chair Michael Selig endorsed the same call and specifically said the legislation protects the crypto industry from a future administration reversing the current regulatory stance through agency action alone, which means the CFTC chairman is explicitly acknowledging that the current favorable regulatory environment for XRP, the March 17th interpretive release naming XRP as a digital commodity, could theoretically be undone by a future administration. The Clarity Act is the legislation that makes it impossible to undo. Armstrong reversed course. Besant framed it as national security. Atkins announced implementation readiness. Selig warned about what happens without it. All four of those things happened on the same day. And that day was April 9th. If you are an XRP holder trying to understand why Thursday's markup is the most important event in this asset's history, the answer is April 9th. The alignment that was assembled on that single day is the political architecture that gives Chairman Tim Scott the coalition he needs to advance the bill this week. Because the moment you understand what April 9th actually assembled, you realize Thursday isn't a vote. It is the detonation of an alignment that took 2 years to build. Now here's where things get serious for the timeline. On May 1st of 2026, Armstrong posted again. 2 words this time, mark it up. That post, published at 4:26 in the afternoon Eastern Time, was directed explicitly at Chairman Tim Scott and the Senate Banking Committee. The CEO, who had cancelled the January markup with a 7-sentence post, was now publicly demanding the committee proceed. His Coinbase chief policy officer, Bari Weiss Shahzad, summarized the compromise result in the clearest possible terms. Banks got more restrictions on rewards, but we protected what matters. And Dante Disparte of Circle added the competitive framing. The United States must choose between leading and being led. Within days of Armstrong's market up post, Chairman Scott announced that the Senate Banking Committee would hold its markup hearing on Thursday, May 14th at 10:30 in the morning Eastern Standard Time. The bill that Armstrong had twice blocked now had the date he had been asked to create. A HarrisX national survey conducted between May the 1st and May 4th of 2026 polled 2,008 registered voters with a margin of error of 2.2 percentage points. It found 52% supported the bill after reviewing a policy summary of the legislation. 11% opposed it. That poll reshaped the political calculus for wavering senators overnight. In a midterm election environment where senators are calculating whether voting for or against legislation helps or hurts their electoral prospects, a survey showing 52% support against 11% opposition changes every risk assessment in the room. And this is where the story becomes dangerous to dismiss. Now let me explain Trump's specific role. Because his administration's architecture around this bill is more precise and more consequential than the general pro-crypto rhetoric that dominates the coverage. Trump signed the Genius Act into law on July 18th of 2025. That signing was the foundational piece of the legislative architecture for crypto. The Genius Act established the federal framework for regulated stablecoins, which grew the stablecoin market 49% to $306 billion within months. It created the legal infrastructure for RLUSD, Ripple's regulated stablecoin, to be custodied by BNY Mellon and to operate within the regulatory framework that institutional compliance departments could approve. But Besant's Wall Street Journal op-ed made explicit what Trump's administration understood from the beginning. The Genius Act is the foundation. The Clarity Act is the walls. Without market structure legislation that clearly defines which digital assets are commodities and which are securities, the stablecoin framework that the Genius Act created cannot fully function because the broader ecosystem of digital assets that stablecoins interact with remains in regulatory gray zones. Besant said the Clarity Act is the necessary next step. That framing is precise. It is not advocacy for crypto. It is a description of the legal and regulatory dependency that makes the Clarity Act essential for the legislative architecture to be complete. Trump named XRP explicitly in his executive order, establishing the United States Crypto Strategic Reserve alongside Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, and Cardano. When XRP appeared in that executive order, it surged 33% in 24 hours, outperforming Bitcoin's 11%. That naming matters not just as a price catalyst, but as a statement of the asset's status in the administration's strategic view. XRP is not one crypto asset among thousands in the current administration's framework. It is one of 5 assets designated for sovereign inclusion in the National Reserve strategy. When the White House is pushing the Clarity Act toward a July 4th signing, and XRP is one of the assets that the Clarity Act locks into permanent federal law as a digital commodity, the connection is not subtle. The administration is pushing for legislation that specifically protects the legal status of an asset it has already included in a sovereign reserve. That is not a coincidence. That is policy coherence. Now here's where things get serious for the deadline. White House advisor Patrick McHenry told the Bitcoin 2026 conference that crypto will take off like a rocket ship once the Clarity Act passes. He picked the July 4th signing target deliberately, America's 250th birthday. The White House wants to sign the legislation that establishes American digital asset dominance on the same day the country celebrates the document that established American sovereignty 250 years ago. The symbolism is intentional. The deadline is hard. Senators who understand the White House's political investment in that July 4th target have a clear signal about the consequences of not delivering. The OCC has conditionally approved Ripple for a national trust bank charter, placing it alongside Circle, BitGo, Fidelity Digital Assets, and Paxos in a new class of federally supervised digital asset institutions. Ripple's Federal Reserve Master Account application is still pending. If it is approved, banks could settle in XRP directly, creating transactional XRP demand that is separate from and additive to ETF demand. Every one of those regulatory developments is contingent on or amplified by the Clarity Act providing the statutory framework that makes institutional engagement legally unambiguous. Now let me lay out exactly what happens to XRP in every scenario on the other side of Thursday's vote, because binary outcomes deserve binary analysis. If the Senate Banking Committee passes the markup on Thursday, May 14th, the cup and handle pattern that XRP has been building since April 17th triggers. The neckline sits at $1.50. A clean committee passage breaks through that level and targets $1.70 to $2 based on pattern mechanics and the historical precedent from similar legislative catalysts in the crypto market. That move happens in the days immediately following the vote, driven by the market repricing the probability of full Senate passage from 62% to materially higher as the committee bottleneck clears. But this is the part almost nobody is calculating. The Senate floor vote would follow in June, a 60-vote threshold that requires bipartisan support. The administration has been explicit that they want this done before the Memorial Day recess ends, and the midterm calendar begins consuming legislative bandwidth. If the floor vote passes in June, the White House's July 4th signing target becomes achievable. At that point, Standard Chartered's projection of $4 to $8 billion in cumulative XRP ETF inflows by year-end is the specific mechanism by which the price moves from the post-markup level to the $3 to $5 year-end consensus range. And under the higher inflow scenario, where ETF assets cross the $5 billion level at which ETFs hold more XRP than all exchanges combined, the supply shock that analysts have been modeling produces the kind of price movement that the current 1.46 level makes look extraordinarily compressed in hindsight. If the committee fails to pass the markup, or if the markup is postponed past the May 21st Memorial Day deadline, the bill is almost certainly shelved until 2030. Senator Lummis confirmed this at the Bitcoin 2026 conference. The political calendar that follows Memorial Day is dominated by midterm election positioning. The Senate's remaining working weeks before midterms are too few and too politically charged for market structure legislation to advance. XRP returns to the $1.28 to $1.45 range it has traded in for most of 2026, and the price catalyst that every institutional allocation has been waiting on disappears for 4 years. And what happens next changes everything for anyone still on the sidelines. The asymmetry between those two scenarios is why Thursday is the most important day in XRP's history. 12% downside to the structural floor in the failure scenario. 200 to 600% upside to the analyst target range in the success scenario. And the alignment of forces behind passage is stronger today than it has been at any point in the bill's 2-year legislative history. Armstrong reversed. Besant called it national security. Atkins announced implementation readiness. A HarrisX survey showed 52 to 11% public support. Over 120 crypto companies signed a joint letter demanding the vote. Trump named XRP in a sovereign reserve, and the White House has a date attached to the signature. The 24 senators on the panel split 13 Republicans to 11 Democrats. 13 yes votes send the bill to the full Senate. Chairman Tim Scott has called getting all 13 Republicans on board his red zone target. Every Republican senator on that panel who votes no is voting against a bill that the Republican president's Treasury Secretary called a national security issue, that the Republican president's SEC chairman announced implementation readiness for, and that 52% of American voters support. The political math of voting no in that environment is difficult to justify in a midterm year. And this is where the story becomes dangerous to ignore. Let me give you the investment calculator, because the abstract needs to be made concrete. At $1.46, $1,000 buys you approximately 685 XRP. At 1.70, the committee passage immediate target, those 685 tokens are worth 1,165. At $2, the upper bound of the committee passage target range, they are worth $1,370. At $2.80, Standard Chartered's near-term institutional consensus, they are worth $1,918. At $5, the lower bound of the Post-Clarity Act year-end consensus range, they are worth $3,425. At $8, the bull case, the White House advisor cited at Bitcoin 2026, they are worth $5,180. At $10, the supply shock upper bound for the $5 billion ETF AUM scenario, they are worth $6,850. At $28, Standard Chartered's 2030 institutional adoption base case, they are worth $19,180. At 5,000 invested, multiply every number by 5. At 10,000, multiply by 10. At 25,000, multiply by 25. The structural floor at 1.28 puts maximum downside at approximately 12%. Brian Armstrong went from blocking this bill twice to posting market up in the span of 4 months. Scott Besant went from Treasury policy framing to national security framing in the span of one op-ed. Paul Atkins went from regulatory guidance to implementation readiness announcement. Trump went from pro-crypto rhetoric to a sovereign reserve executive order naming XRP. And the political machinery of the United States government is now pointing at July 4th as the date a 250th birthday present gets signed into law. Now here's where things get serious for the next 72 hours. 72 hours, one committee room, 13 senators deciding whether to send the most consequential piece of crypto legislation in American history to the Senate floor or to the shelf until 2030. Armstrong reversed. Bessent declared national security. Nationally, Atkins said, "We are ready." Trump said, "Dominance." The markup is Thursday. The institutional players who understand what this alignment means are not waiting for Thursday morning to position. They are positioned. The compliance departments at the major banks are running the post-markup scenarios tonight. The mandate amendment committees at the major asset managers are reviewing their internal eligibility screens for XRP exposure tonight. The product committee reviews for XRP ETF filings that have been queued up for months are being finalized tonight in anticipation of the trigger event that happens 72 hours from now. The market that you see on the chart at 1.46 is the market that exists before the trigger event has fired. The market that exists after the trigger event is a different market, with a different supply structure, a different institutional bid, and a different price floor. The asymmetry between the two markets is the entire investment thesis, compressed into a single 72-hour window. You cannot wait for the result and then react to it. The institutional capital that reacts on Thursday afternoon is not buying at the price it was Wednesday night. The price it pays is the price the institutional bid creates as the result is announced, and the price it creates is the price the chart prints for everyone else to react to. Macro storms pass, infrastructure lasts, and the infrastructure that 72 hours from now will be assembled by the most aligned political, regulatory, and industry coalition in this bill's history is the infrastructure that converts every preceding development in this cycle into operational reality. Bills don't change history. The moments when the last opposition breaks do. Thursday is that moment. And the price you see at $1.46 is the last reading before the chart belongs to a different market. Smash that like button. Drop your prediction for Thursday's vote and your XRP target for year-end in the comments. Let's build this community's call before the vote happens. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when the result comes in at 10:30 Thursday morning, when the bipartisan margin is announced, when the Senate floor vote schedule is published, and when the first post-markup ETF flow data is reported, my breakdown drops within the hour of each event. You do not want to find out what happened after the price has already moved. See you on the other side.